Thank you, everyone. It's such a joy to be here. It's great to be able to spend some time with folks and get to know you all and share with you a little bit about who I am and what I do. Before I begin, though, I wonder if I could get a little bit of feedback from the group. Not about my sermon, but when I know, thank you. When I say, you'll get your $5 later. When I say the word seminary, what comes to mind? What comes to mind when you hear the word seminary? Feel free.
College.
College, okay.
For clergy.
Clergy, education for clergy, okay.
For females.
No females?
Well, female seminary.
Yeah, that's right, that's right, that's right.
Residential.
Residential, okay, okay.
Long.
Long? Yeah, that's for sure. That's for sure. It can definitely be long. Yeah.
Not the experience I had in college.
Not the experience you had. Yeah. Man, as someone who has to deal with a lot of alumni, that phrase, that's not the experience I had, is something that I encounter a lot. Yeah.
Preaching.
Preaching, okay. Anything else? Care? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we do try to provide care for our students as well as model for them the kind of care that they are going to need to exercise as future leaders. So apart from maybe 3 years working in the .com sector in Seattle in the 1990s, I have spent my entire career working in theological education. Which when I used to say that didn't seem like a long time, but now that I look back, it's almost 30 years of life spent dedicated to theological education. And for me, theological education is about the most important thing that I feel that I can be doing as a way of sort of expressing my own faith and commitment to Christ. Because I feel like helping to train faithful and effective church leaders is something that is essential to the ministry of the church today. Whether lay or ordained, we need faithful and effective leaders supporting our churches, serving our churches, and proclaiming the gospel in God's beloved world. One of the reasons why I've given my life to this is that in my own early life, in my teens, I was a part of a non-denominational church where our clergy didn't have to go to seminary. Some of them didn't even have to go to Bible college. And there was a strong, not only anti-intellectual bias in the preaching and in the life of those communities, but really a kind of a sense that, you know, all you really needed was the Spirit to lead you, and you could figure out how to lead a church. And I suffered a lot of abuse from really poorly trained, some well-meaning, some poorly meaning clergy. And I wanted to prevent that from happening to other people. So I really think that so I'm my sort of hobby, that my consuming hobby, is that I'm an amateur potter. So I spend as much time as God will allow me hunched over a potter's wheel, throwing teapots and chalices and things like that. And it's a life-giving practice for me that helps me to kind of get out of my head and into my hands in a way. And you know, the thing about pottery is that when you're throwing it, when you're making it, and your fingerprints get into the clay, and then the clay is fired to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, what was malleable, recyclable clay turns into forever vitrified ceramic. And your fingerprints are in that ceramic forever. In fact, when we go on archaeological sites, like the kind that I mentioned in my sermon, and you pick up shards of pottery, you'll see the fingerprints of people who have been dead for 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years. And I think that ministry is kind of like that, is that clergy leave their fingerprints on the souls of their parishioners. And I want to make sure that the fingerprints that they leave are where they should be and are contributing to the formation of this vessel that God inhabits in our lives and in our churches. So for me, theological education is one of the ways that I go about doing that. So the church has been involved in theological education in one form or the other pretty much from its inception. That should be no surprise. What was Jesus's job after he stopped being a woodworker? He was a teacher, that's right. So education is inherently important to the Christian church because we follow a crucified and risen and glorified teacher, someone who took education seriously. For the earliest Christians, the way that they learned not only to be Christians, but then to lead congregations or communities of faith was through not a kind of formal seminary system, but often through forms of mentorship. So we think about the model of the disciples walking with Jesus for those 3 years, setting down their nets, setting down one profession, and taking up a time of intensive training and mentorship with Jesus, walking along the Galilee, learning from him, watching what he did, and learning how to do what he did. And so many of the stories about the kind of fumbling lives of the disciples where Peter says or does something stupid is exactly the kind of thing you would expect a student to do. They're going to make mistakes. And so they model for us this practice of mentorship as a mode of education. And for much of the church's history, early history, this was the primary way that people who were going to be involved in Christian leadership learned how to be Christian leaders, whether ordained or lay or what have you. They followed in the footsteps, they mentored alongside someone else. We think about the great church theologian Augustine of Hippo, this incredible figure in the in the 4th century of the church, who himself was mentored by Bishop Ambrose, who was a significant preacher and theologian of his own right from Milan. So these practices of community and mentorship being the place where theological education occurs really was the norm for most of the early church's history. And then we get into the Middle Ages, sort of after the fall of the Roman Empire, 6th century, up until, let's say, through the Reformation into the 16th century. So that long 1,000-year period in Western Europe, we see the rise of particular centers of learning emerge. And some of them are associated with monastic houses, and some of them are associated with what would later become schools or universities. And these are places that are formed around sort of the collection of knowledge and information. So I have a class that I teach and a book that I'm working on that's all about the church and information technology, which I know sounds like a crazy combination of things. This was the subject of my PhD in the early 2000s. And so when ChatGPT became a thing a couple of years ago, I was like, yes, this is finally my moment because I've been doing research on this stuff for decades. Well, the church has always used the information technology of its day as a way of spreading the gospel. When we think about something like the Roman roads network in the ancient world, which provided safe and quick, relatively speaking, communication all the way from the British Isles down into parts of Ethiopia. And this road network was the information technology of the ancient world. And so the Christians used this as a way of spreading the gospel and teaching and mentoring in a distributed kind of model. Well, after the fall of the Roman Empire, there became little pockets of deposits of knowledge throughout Western Europe that we would associate with monasteries and eventually schools that were centered around scriptoria, where ancient texts would be preserved and transcribed and retained and studied. And these little pots of information all throughout Europe, a lot of it stemming from a monastic tradition that comes from the west of Scotland and the east of Ireland, became the foundation for Christian knowledge that was passed along not just through mentorship or following along in the paths of a great teacher, but by reading and studying. And so to be prepared for ministry meant during that 1,000-year period of the Middle Ages, meant dedicating a certain amount of time to reading and interpreting of texts. And these texts included everything from scripture or parts of scripture to eventually, by the time we get into the 13th century and the work of Thomas Aquinas, looking at with the rediscovery of Aristotle and Greek philosophy, this too became part of it. And so to prepare to be a cleric, to prepare to be a clergy person, meant committing a tremendous amount of effort into learning original languages, reading these texts, memorizing these texts, debating these texts, and being able to pass that knowledge along to other people. Now, as you can imagine, this was not something that everyone was particularly interested in, and the sorts of people that might make really, really good scholars might make really lousy clergy. And so we end up in the Middle Ages with a significant divide in Western Christianity between those who are particularly well educated, thanks to their time in schools or universities or these monastic houses, and the sort of gigging priests, the sort of working priests that's out there in the countryside who may or may not be literate, who may or may not be trained, who may or may not be called by God to serve, and it may just be that they're the fifth son of the third earl of such and such, and they need to sort of shoo them off to some sort of job where they won't get underfoot. And so there's a real crisis in clergy education that comes to a head by the 16th century. And this is the time of the Protestant Reformations. We're thinking Henry VIII in the Church of England. We're thinking Martin Luther, John Calvin, Heinrich Zwingli, and the continent, a time when there was a proliferation of debates about what it means to know God or to read scripture, or what languages do we read scripture in and what languages do we pray in. And so there became a need for more kind of consistency in how we prepare clergy. On the Reformed side, on the Protestant side, that consistency meant they need to know the Bible, they need to know it in the language of the people, they need to know prayers that are in the language of the people, they need to be able to read sometimes sermons that are sort of sent out from a central church authority, and they need to be kind of holy people who are able to faithfully lead communities of faith across Europe. On the Roman Catholic side, by the time we get to the end of the 16th century and we have this thing called the Council of Trent, the Roman Catholic Church was really concerned about keeping a close eye on doctrine and teaching as it had been passed on from the ancient church into the present day, in a way of responding to a lot of the kind of crowding into the marketplace, as it were, by the Protestants. The 16th century is a fantastic time to look at Roman Catholicism, by the way, because we get all kinds of amazing innovations in church architecture. Think about Baroque architecture, church music in terms of like polyphony. The Roman Catholic Church was trying to get it sort of claw back its market share from the Protestants. And one of the ways it was doing this was through the development of a thing called the seminary. Now, when you've already mentioned what things come to mind when you hear the word seminary: college, training, preaching, care, all of these wonderful things. What do you think the root of the word seminary is? What do you think the root word behind seminary is? Yeah. Yes, seed. That's right. A seminary is a seed bed. So the original metaphor used from the Council of Trent was that seminaries would be like the seed bed that a gardener uses to plant seeds. My wife, even though I grew up on the farm, my wife is the green-thumbed person in our marriage. And I can know when it's going to be spring, not by looking at the calendar, not by looking at what the date is on my phone or the attention to the weather. It's when these little pots, I had to control my language because I'm at church, these little pots, sometimes I forget I'm a priest, show up on every little windowsill in our house, and she's growing these little, so my wife is basically turning our home, which is in a seminary, ironically, into a seminary every spring. And the idea is that you want to plant clergy in an environment where they will grow and flourish and be able to pass on the knowledge, the tradition, and the practice. And so this was the Tridentine or the Council of Trent response to this. Another response on the Protestant side was to publish an inordinate amount of information. And so Protestants from the 16th century, really through the 18th century, were just like cranking out instructional manuals on what it means to be a clergy person. You've got 5 volumes of Calvin's Institutes that are kind of a systematic theology that covers all aspects of life. You have dozens of volumes of Luther's works, which become this kind of foundation for thinking about what it means to be a Lutheran clergy person, so on and so forth. So you have kind of 2 traditions, one that's reliant heavily on printing, another information technology, and the other was reliant on a more structured form of education. And then we come into the modern era in the 19th century, and we see a significant influence on the way that theology is taught in universities in Europe, through the influence of what's called Enlightenment rationalism. And in a word, what this means is theology stopped being a subject that was taught in order to root us in the tradition of the church, in order to help us be effective and faithful pastors in communities of faith, and more as a kind of academic discipline that would be studied alongside other academic disciplines. I did my PhD at the University of Glasgow in Scotland, which I like to tell my friends is the fourth oldest English-speaking university in the world. It was founded in 1492. And it's debatable whether Scots is English, but we'll just assume that it is for the sake of argument. I tell you, it took me months to understand my neighbors in Glasgow. And I'm probably glad that I didn't, because they were probably saying really terrible things about me and my wife. But it's good to know that at the time, Scots was, for argument's sake, an English language. And the university department that I worked in was called the Faculty of Divinity, but it reflected this kind of a rational approach to religion. It was a subject studied alongside other subjects. It was like, in the same way that a geologist studies rocks by looking at them and analyzing them and cracking them open and dissolving them and all these things. That's what I think a geologist does. A theologian in this context studies theology as a kind of objective science, and not at all, or not primarily concerned with how does this make a difference in my life or the lives of communities. At the time, I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to go into ministry. I wasn't entirely sure that I really even believed in God anymore, because I was just sort of in my early 20s kind of deconstruction phase of faith. Eventually I came around, and that's a whole other story. So I'm not an atheist priest. I believe in the resurrection of the body and the whole 9 yards. But there's an objective approach to the study of God and a more subjective approach to the study of God. And we get in the 19th century this thinking about theology as just another academic discipline. In the 20th century, though, there's a significant pivot in the way that theological education is approached, particularly in this country, where the practical ministry is becoming more and more integrated into the study of theology. So seminaries, by the time we get into the 19th and 20th century, are interested in things like supervised ministry training. How can students learn to be effective ministers by learning from other people who are doing ministry? And at this point, by the time we get into the mid-20th century, training for clergy looks a lot like training for a lot of other professions. And so it's kind of like how you would train somebody to be a CPA or a lawyer or a doctor or another sort of white collar, I guess, black collar, white collar job. Being a clergy person was seen as a profession. And so it made sense to sort of teach it within a professional context. But then when you start thinking about, so you've got in this period of time a variety of ways of not only training people, but each approach to training assumes that a clergy person is a certain kind of person. A clergy person is a teacher who is mentored and learns how to pass on a particular way of being and knowing and thinking about God within relationship to community. A clergy person in the Middle Ages is more of a scholar, someone who has a much more of a kind of clerical mindset and is committed to texts and passing on the knowledge of those texts. A clergy person in the Reformation is somebody who can claw back or maybe assert a new way of thinking about religion, depending on if you're part of the Roman Catholic Church or one of the Protestant churches. A clergy person in the university settings of the 19th century, well, they're basically there to sort of contemplate the universe, but they recognize that their involvement in the community is going to be kind of limited. A clergy person in the 20th century is trained like any other profession, because to be a clergy person is to be a member of a professional class. But does that pertain today? Are clergy persons peripatetic scholars? Are they professionals? What do we think about clergy people today? So to answer that question, we have to know a lot about the church. We have to know a lot about the world that we live in. And one thing that we can know for sure is that the world that we live in is changing rapidly, and so too is the church, and so too is theological education. In 2006, we had the highest point of enrollment in theological schools in American history. Something like 80,000 seminarians across all of the 250 odd seminaries at the time, 35,000 of whom were preparing for ordained ministry across all of the churches in North America, everything from Eastern Orthodox to Pentecostal. But from 2006 to 2020, we've seen a 20% drop in enrollment across the sector. And we think this is caused by a couple of things. First, the 2008 financial recession hit institutions of faith particularly hard. A lot of our seminaries, not just in the Episcopal Church, but across the seminary ecosystem, have small endowments, are run by well-meaning but not particularly effective leaders, and couldn't rebound from the kinds of financial challenges that emerged in 2008. We then have an enrollment cliff that we're in the middle of falling off of right now, which is there are fewer and have been fewer undergraduates who have been produced by higher education institutions who would then go into seminary. So it means not only are our schools more financially fragile, there's also fewer students who might be enrolling in these schools. And then the third thing that hits seminaries in North America is a radical shift in religious practices in North America that has been widely documented, where we have now the largest single religious group in North America are the nones, the non-religious. So you have a shrinking market, you have fewer potential students, you have less resources. The response to this has been a tremendous proliferation of mergers and closures of theological schools that are about 2 or so every 4 months out of the total of 250 theological schools in North America. And that's been accelerating over the last 10 years. And now somewhere between 60 and 50% of all the theological schools in America are affiliated, partnered, or embedded in another institution, because it's impossible for many of them to do the work their own. In the Episcopal Church, this pattern is something that's been going on maybe a little bit sooner than the rest. You know, we've always been trendsetters, the Episcopalians. So we've been experiencing some of these challenges sooner than some of our other mainline or Roman Catholic siblings in theological education. Our seminary system started in 1817 when my seminary was founded, the General Theological Seminary, by an act of the General Convention of the Episcopal Church. And it was intended to be the seminary for the Episcopal Church. One place where clergy can go and study and be formed to be faithful Episcopalians. Up to that point, if you wanted to be an Episcopal clergy person or trained as an Episcopal clergy person, you would either have to mentor or shadow another clergy person and maybe catch up with a couple of courses at a local college, maybe this little place called Harvard or Yale, these little schools that sort of dotted the East Coast. Or you would have to go all the way to Oxford or Cambridge. That was if you wanted to be an Anglican and trained as an Anglican, Oxford and Cambridge were your only options. The survival rate was only 75% of clergy who would take the ship back and forth. And so we were literally losing clergy because of theological education. So General Seminary was founded. But quickly, within 5 years, other seminaries within the Episcopal Church were also founded, in part to reflect something of the local charisms of each region in the church. So Virginia Theological Seminary was founded in 1823 to reflect the particularities of Virginia at the time, and all the way up to the last Episcopal seminary that was founded in the 1950s, the Seminary of the Southwest in Austin. So we had a number of seminaries formed, but by the time the 1980s rolled around, the church recognized that it had too many seminaries, about 12 by 1980, and that there was a cliff on the horizon that they needed to really address. And so over the last 50 years, a number of our seminaries have either closed or combined or changed their missions in order to adapt to this changing world where ministry vocation means something different than maybe it has before. At General Seminary, our approach to this was in 2021, when I became president, to go through a pretty significant discernment process to think about what does it mean for us to faithfully continue the ministry of education and formation that we were set up by this denomination to do in a way that's consistent with what the church needs today. And with the board and with the faculty, we decided to pivot away from an exclusively residential model and to build what we thought at the time would be the most robust hybrid low residency program that we could possibly design, something that balanced the tradition of our institution with the needs of the church where clergy are being trained all over the country. And we also decided that we couldn't do it alone and that we needed to make sure that the resources of our institution were safeguarded for the Episcopal Church. So we found the largest and strongest Episcopal organization that we could partner with to help ensure that our resources would be stewarded wisely. And that was why we affiliated eventually with Virginia Theological Seminary. And so now today, as a result of that, we went from having fewer than 3 new Master of Divinity students matriculate in 2021 to 15 a year for the last 3 years. And we'll have about 60 Master of Divinity students by this time next year, which is more students than we've had in 15 years. Yeah, thank you. So that is theological education in a nutshell, the history of theological education within the church and within our denomination, and a little bit about general. And I think I've got some time. So if you have questions or curiosities, I would love to field. Yeah.
This non-group that you
Yeah.
talked about, are they non-spiritual, non-believers, or they just don't need to affiliate with a church? They don't need to be present in a church, or atheist comes to mind, but where are they spiritual?
Yeah, so they're often called spiritual, but not religious.
Okay.
It's a really interesting demographic. And if I'm ever invited back, I could talk all about this, because this was a major research project of mine for a while. They tend to have originated from some church home, but then through a variety of reasons, no longer affiliate with that tradition, with a tradition. And there's a number of reasons for this. Some scholars say that it had, and this, by the way, accelerated from about 1993 until the present. So the lines crossed in terms of where are the growing religious traditions in North America in the mid-1990s. And there are about 4 reasons for this that I think are plausible. The first has more to do with the early 2000s, which is you've got the rise of evangelical fundamentalism being aligned with a political party. And for many folks who grew up in religious traditions, that was seen as a problem. And so it led to a certain amount of attrition in the early 2000s. We saw religion, not necessarily Christianity, but certainly radicalized Islam as being seen as a threat, which was relatively new in American culture, to look at another religion as something that was expressly violent and dangerous. And so religion itself lost some credibility. Early 2000s, we have a number of very public and painful sexual abuse scandals coming out of Roman Catholicism, which further erodes kind of the credibility of the Roman Catholic Church. But the one reason that I think is the most interesting, and the one that's the least obvious, has to do with the coincidence of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Because during the Cold War, to be an American meant to not be an atheist commie. And once that external threat, or that external reason for being a faithful Christian or religious American is removed, then we start to see a really significant nosedive in religious practice. So one of the arguments is that as we no longer have a secular atheist enemy, there's no longer the kind of motivation in the American populace to continue to be religious. So all of that contributes to a pretty significant decline in religious membership, which coincides with dropping numbers of participation in voluntary organizations. Like think about Rotary Club or PEO or bowling leagues that you'd be a part of. All of these voluntary associations are decreasing in number as society is finding new ways for people to interact and connect. People still need connection and meaning, but the church or organized religion isn't serving in the same way as it was. Yeah.
Well, what about during the same period in which American culture, it's an economy that runs on mobility too. And historically, when we've grown up, born in Wheeling, grown up in Wheeling, stay in Wheeling, the tendency is to follow that path into your church early and stay with it. And now that we move around a lot, finding a new church isn't always an easy thing to do, or maybe puts up barriers you feel that makes you stop.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. And so there is some evidence to suggest that mobility can cut in both ways.
Yeah.
So clearly that America became a relatively religious country an immigrant population does imply that there's not necessarily a causal relationship between mobility and lack of religious observance. However, when you look at what are historically the least religious areas in the United States, the Pacific Northwest has the highest percentage of non-religious, spiritual but not religious people as anywhere else in the country. And that has been a curiosity for scholars of religion for decades. And there are two reasons for that I think are probable. One is if you are leaving the East or the Midwest in the 19th century, it's really difficult to bring your religion with you on the Oregon Trail. And you're settling in towns that are really far apart. And so there just may not be churches in late 19th, early 20th century Pacific Northwest that you can worship with. And so those practices just don't get passed on. The other, which is, I think, less probable, but somehow more attractive to me, is that the Pacific Northwest is so beautiful in terms of its natural environment that people are more likely to describe some sort of spiritual connection with nature than they are through organized religious practices.
Many years in the Northwest, and I'm certain by that.
Yeah, I do too, yeah.
And I would also think that it's partially generational in that the parents and grandparents of today who stopped going to church, say, in the 80s.
Yeah.
And their children have no experience of going to church.
Yeah.
I mean, like people who grew up in the 50s and 60s either went to church frequently, or at least they went on Christmas and Easter.
Yeah.
And now you have generations that don't even they have no connection to any particular faith tradition at all.
That's right.
Because their parents suddenly became, inactive or non-believers.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. There's some really terrifying data in the Church of England about the declining number of baptisms and confirmations over the last 50 years. And that points to some significant decline within the Church of England. And so, there are just scads of sociologists that are writing about this and have been for the last 30 or 40 years, because we've known that this trend is developing. So one argument is to really lament this, that faith is transmitted generationally, and the breaking down of that generational transmission is something that has an inevitable negative consequence. Another interesting interpretation, which may also be true, suggests that rates of religious observance in a society are not linear, but they're more of like a sine curve. And so, and if you sort of look at the long history of the West, and even like the shorter history of the Americas, 18th century Americans, such as they were not a particularly religious bunch, in part because they didn't have communities of practice and faith. And so religious observation was relatively low. Then you have revivalistic moments where it becomes more religious and so on and so forth, right? Well, this curve was disrupted after the Second World War. And in the kind of post-Eisenhower era, where mainline churches, particularly the Episcopal Church, just boomed, in part because church membership was associated in some traditions with sort of social advancement. We have, many buildings that are, fellowship halls and buildings in the churches that are from this post-World War II era. And what we're seeing now is a reset of the sine curve to the kinds of rates of religiosity that we would expect, which would suggest then that some of our institutions are just going to contract, and some of them are going to die. But that's sort of part of life of religious institutions.
What is the Episcopal Seminary's position on the separation of church and state, especially?
Speak up, Catherine.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
What is the Episcopal Seminary's position on the separation of church and state, especially in light of the last 9 years we've been on?
Well,
should I stop recording?
Yeah. Cone of silence. Yeah. Well, I think, of course, the Episcopal Church is not an established church. It is one church of many. in one religious organizations of many in the United States. And the separation of church and state cuts both ways, where it means that the government is not able to interfere with the affairs of religious organizations, and religious organizations should have a certain limited amount of ability to interfere with the role of government. And in our own tradition, the first of those really came to the fore, not in the United States, but in the 1830s in England, when Parliament decided to dissolve a number of Irish bishoprics, and a group of committed Christians in Oxford began writing against this and formed what later became the Oxford movement or the Tractarians, which became some of the spiritual ancestors of a lot of North American Episcopalians of a particular sort of spiritual stripe. So the separation of church and state is something that I think we inherit as sort of our Reformation heritage, but it's not straightforward. And I think in the same way that if you asked 25 Episcopalians, how is Christ present in the Eucharist, you would get 25 different answers. And if you would ask 25 different Episcopalians what the relationship is between church and state, you'd probably get 25 different answers. For me, speaking for myself, Michael, not for the denomination, I do think that what is helpful to remember is that the earliest Christians were not, strictly speaking, a political group. If anything, they were sort of really active dissidents, because you don't get crucified by Rome by just preaching love your neighbor. You get crucified by Rome by upsetting the apple cart and claiming an authority that's higher than the emperor. And the reason that Christians died in the ways that they did in the first 3.5 centuries of our church's existence was because we were a threat to a particular social and political process which invested a handful of people with divine or near divine-like power and authority, and they demanded a level of obedience that was almost exactly the same as the kind of obedience that you would give to a god. And so Christians were opposed to this, arguing, first of all, that all of the kind of kingdoms of the world were only sort of secondary to the big kingdom of God that God has in God's mind for the world. And also that there is no Caesar but Christ. The claim Jesus is Lord, Christos Kyrios, is a Christianized rebranding of Caesar as Lord. And so, in fact, it's really interesting. The New Testament languages for Jesus, Savior, Lord, Redeemer, all of these were like printed on coins in terms related to the emperor. And so Christians were subverting political systems from the get-go. And I think it's tragic that we sometimes forget that today.
That's fascinating. Can I ask 2 questions and then you can choose your own adventure?
Okay.
The uptake that you're seeing in seminary enrollment and matriculation, is that, are you seeing increase in diversity of your students too? Not just, white men, but whoever else? And then part 2, it sounds like you've studied these things a lot. Do you tend to see either in the Episcopal Church or just broadly across Christianity when there's a spike in seminary matriculations that maybe sometime after that, 10, 20, whatever year delay, there's an increase in church attendance, membership, participation, what have you?
I don't know the second answer. I mean, it'd be fun to kind of study that. My hunch is that I think that religious adherence rises and falls on trends that are kind of outside of religious organizations. It's sort of the theory that churches tend to grow, not all churches, some churches grow despite demographic shifts, but churches tend to grow or shrink based on the growth or shrinkage of the region that they're in. So the largest Episcopal churches tend to be in places where we've had the largest population growth in the country in the last 20 years or so. Not every church, thankfully, but the kinds of, it's very tempting for well-meaning but slightly prideful rectors to assume that they were so gifted by the Holy Spirit that their church tripled in size at the same time that their town quadrupled in size. So I know some of these clergy, and they would never acknowledge that fact. In terms of the changing shape of the matriculants, our approach at General was to think, so you know Jesus' parable about the wedding feast where this guy sets out this big wedding banquet and invites all the hoity-toity people to come, but nobody shows up. So he sends his servant out to the byways and highways to bring everybody in. That's kind of how I felt in general, was that we have 200 years of history here. We've been the seminary where like most of the archbishops of Canterbury have come to speak to the American church. We're the seminary that interpreted a kind of form of kind of Catholic Anglicanism for the North American context. I mean, we're the place where Desmond Tutu got the call that he was receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. So we have a lot to give, and nobody was coming. And so we thought, why don't we figure out how to faithfully take this gift and bring it to people where they're at, which is exactly what the distributed program is all about, is reaching out to people where they're at and giving the church what it says that it needs. So we talked to all of our bishops, and we went from having fewer than 10 dioceses in our student body to 30 or 40 dioceses right now. So we're definitely now serving the whole church in a way that I think we were called to do originally. But in terms of the diversity, I will say we are probably as diverse as the Episcopal Church, which isn't saying a lot because the Episcopal Church is a majority white church. But we are doing things to actively encourage more diverse matriculations. Things like changing the timings of when we make admissions decisions so that we can respond more quickly to students so that they kind of get the aid and the place they need right then and there, and to having a curriculum that is intentionally diverse and a very diverse faculty. We have how many faculty?
How many women are?
Oh, 60%, 60-40. Yeah, more women than men. Average age of our current students is 44. Yeah.
So I'm pretty much born and bred here, and my wife and I had our sons do all the acolyte choir stuff all the way through high school, and once they were gone from the church. They're back in their respective communities, Pittsburgh, Charlotte, but of course the new age, contemporary stuff. I know a fair number of young people in this community who are part of the new age community stuff. I've been to the various services. I get the appeal to younger people. The music is awful, but the way the pastors preach, and I've dived into what your experience was with it. But they're true believers. Both my sons lead Bible groups. I mean, it's a remarkable change from when they graduated from St. Matthew's. So I guess, and I'm sure, of course, you're quite aware of that. And I'm just curious if there's any sort of field to react to that type of thing in education from the Episcopal standpoint. I mean, it's literally competing, if you will.
I think, we are competing in a way. There are some structural challenges and cultural challenges that make fair competition difficult. So structurally, our church is based on what you could call in kind of economic terms a franchise model, where we have a fairly set sense of what our churches and our liturgies and the whole shooting match should look like, so that if you worship here or if you go to St. Aidan's on Camano Island, Washington, 2 hours north of Seattle on this little island in the Puget Sound, you're going to get a very similar worship experience, very similar hymns. We have authorized hymnals in our church. You can use hymns from other sources, but we have a set of authorized hymnals, a set of authorized liturgies. We may not have like an authorized theology, but we definitely have kind of we package it in a way that's consistent. You could say, if you were sarcastic, that it's kind of the McDonaldization of the church. And this went so well with post-Eisenhower era boomer dominant American culture, where that's what we wanted. We wanted a recognizable cultural experience across the country. Generations now are favoring more like the local and the eclectic, and what seems is often authentic is like a restaurant that like serves seasonally picked greens, and the chicken's name is Gertie, and she made the eggs. You know what I mean? It's an emphasis not on the kind of the national, but on the local. And so I think adapting to that, which we can do as Episcopalians, but it takes a little bit of skill, a skill that we may not have taught in our seminaries for a long time. That's one thing that we need to do, but that's a structural issue, I think. And it's both structural and cultural. It's structural in that we have a fairly authorized approach to our received liturgy and practice, and we are in a culture that doesn't particularly value that anymore. But that said, you go into one of these mega churches, and it's the same mega church, whether you're in Tulsa or if you're in Toledo. And so there is something, there is an accessibility and a low bar to religious practice that these kinds of churches offer that I think may be attractive to people, but it's a bit like trying to, run a marathon when all you eat is Slim Fast. There's something about the depth of our tradition or traditioned churches that provides a level of nuance and resource that can help people make it through the complexities of life. Because for the most part, a lot of these large mega churches are selling the fast food equivalent of the gospel. And we're still seeing as much decline now among evangelical churches as we are in mainline churches. And so I think it would be a mistake for Episcopalians to say, well, if we just had choruses and guitars and drums and a 55-minute sermon, we'd be okay. God save us from that.
Who's 35, and her friends, they cherish the tradition of the Episcopal Church and want that to remain. So there are some young people.
Yeah, mine too. My 21-year-old daughter, when she goes, if she ever were to go to church with a friend that's not, liturgical church, she just complains incessantly. And when she comes back to New York, she's like, let's go to real church. And she wants hymns. She was raised well.
So it's not all.
No, it's not. And it's not forever. I mean, who's to say that a 35-year-old person today who is either not religious or in a mega church might not, when they're 60, come to the Episcopal Church. We just can't presume that we know how these trend lines are going to go, but we can learn from how we got it.
And there's also, I remember about 15 years ago, I heard Kathleen Norris speak, and she talked about how she believed firmly that there were trends.
Yeah.
And she said, the children of the people who are, embracing, sort of the free form, whatever, they want the tradition. They discover Compline, they discover, smells and bells. It's like, why did you keep this from it? And she said it's very much a trend that one generation rejects the previous generation's ideas on so many different things. And they'll often go back to a tradition that was the previous generation.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we see a rise in sort of the trad Catholic movement, traditional Catholics. We've seen an increase in the US and abroad in Orthodoxy. So there are plenty of traditions that are even more complicated and burdensome than our own that are thriving in the world today.
Is there anybody, maybe one final question before I take like 2 minutes?
Okay.
Michael?
Yeah.
You mentioned, if you're able to come back, because there's some really good questions. And I think this is timely for us as a diocese, because what is Bishop Cowden's goal for church growth for the next?
Helens in West Virginia by 2033.
Yes. And
We've got some work to do.
we have some work to do. And to the question on spiritual but not religious, I read a book a couple of months ago, The Great De-Churching.
Oh, it's so good.
And great, I'm glad you said that, because I was concerned if I say a book, what will the theologian?
No, it's a great book. It's a great book.
The Great De-Churching, and it sort of gives raw data on any number of reasons why folks have left not just an evangelical tradition, but also Protestant and Roman Catholics.
Who's the author? Okay, never mind. I
It-
have named.
Email me and I can get it to you. But it's in my office. And so that, it's fascinating because it also talks about what would potentially bring them back. And that had initiated in my own mind, what are some things that we can implement here that might speak to those, not necessarily just one in particular, but different things will bring different folks back depending on their tradition. And much, from education to community and relationship. And so one of the things that I want to do here is do some intentional training and formation of lay leaders to become spiritual leaders using the Revive program. Here, it's put out by Forward Movement. And actually, we talked about this last week when we had a small conversation on the book study that the diocese did, Learning from London, because Jason Pfaff, the author of that book, is talking about how the Diocese of London churches there are bucking the trend on hemorrhaging members.
Yeah.
They're actually growing. And so there are a number of, there's some fruit in that book. And so we actually talked about at the beginning of the year, doing some sound bites on the questions the diocese had posed to, see where we are as a congregation to capitalize on the opportunities in the community to reach out to those that might be spiritual but not religious, still seeking that connection to a some sort of faith tradition. Because I think as human beings, it's in our DNA that we are meant to be together. And that's one of the great gifts of the church, I think, is we value and understand that we are made to be together. And so that's the message we have, like, come, because we are stronger when you're present with us. To the comments you made about colleges no longer really being places where folks are identified to then perhaps move on to seminary. That's another focus at the diocesan level. We have one of the other archdeacons is for campus ministry, and our vocations director, new vocations director, is also the part-time campus missioner at WVU. The bishop's understanding is that if we focus on campus ministry, that is what sows the seed, because high school students graduate and they go and they don't have that faith support network, that community that they have been in. And so if you can focus on faith formation at the college level, that we would then see, hopefully, expect to see more individuals that are called to ordained ministry. And I think, to your point, if we are focusing on campus ministry, not everybody is called to ordained ministry. But if we're nurturing and fostering those relationships, recognizing that we don't find God just at in our congregation, but God is universal and can be found in other churches, that we then create opportunity for growth in the church beyond that.
Well, there was a comment made this weekend at convention about, we may get lucky and get some Episcopalians, but we will form a lot of Christians.
Yes.
That's great. That's great.
Can you say that again?
I think, and I'm misquoting it, but the idea was, we may, in reaching out to all these people, we may form disciples or Christians, and we may get lucky and form a few Episcopalians as well.
And so I'm sure I for one, would love to have you back because it's timely, I think, at the diocesan level. I am but a humble parish priest, but I could direct you to
The Archdeacon of Disaster.
the Archdeacon of Disaster. I could point you to the canon for ministry and mission. Because yes, this is right up our alley in our diocese today. So thank you for your time and being with us.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure. Good to see you.
Thank you all. Dismissed. Class dismissed.